Hello friends, and welcome to Night Whisper. This is a quiet place where we explore the unknown together, slowly, calmly, and without fear. If you find comfort in these stories, and you'd like to stay with us on future nights, you're always welcome to subscribe. It gently helps the channel grow, and it means more than you know. You can also leave us off, like if the story helps you relax, and feel free to share any thoughts that drift through your mind in the comments. And just out of curiosity, where are you listening from tonight? I love reading where these stories travel to. Chapter 1. The night the sky paused, the evening descended on Chicago O'Hare, like a soft sigh, folding the airport into itself. The low gray clouds pressed gently across the sky, almost as if the heavens were leaning closer to listen to the hum of human motion below. In the terminals, travelers moved with a familiar rhythm, rolling suitcases gliding over polished floors, boarding gates calling their names in soft, mechanical voices. Every sound seemed ordinary, predictable, part of a carefully orchestrated pattern. Even the air carried the scent of jet fuel and warm metal, the steady perfume of work that had been done 1,000 times before. And yet, on this afternoon, there was a moment when time itself seemed to hesitate. It began quietly. A single ramp mechanic glanced up from the nose of a Boeing 737, a simple glance that would change everything. At first, it looked like nothing more than a trick of the light, a shima in the gray. But then he saw the shape of disk, suspended silently above gate. C-17 in his chest tightened with something that was neither fear nor excitement, but an awareness that the world had shifted, even if just a fraction. It hovered there, still as a suspended thought, beneath the heavy ceiling of clouds that seemed pressed down from above, waiting for someone to notice. The object did not move like the airplanes that cut through the sky with their precise arcs, nor did it behave like the helicopters that spun their rotors in predictable patterns. It simply existed, a smooth, metallic disk that caught the dim afternoon light in strange ways, reflecting it softly, almost playfully, with a dull silver gray that sometimes mirrored the clouds, sometimes swallowed them. The underside absorbed shadows from the airport below, while the top blended with the gray above. It was as if the sky itself had been bent and polished, and someone had placed a foreign, perfect shape within it, a shape that refused to obey gravity or expectation. The mechanic's hand froze on the wing of the aircraft, eyes locked on the object. Around him, coworkers followed the line of his gaze. A subtle murmur spread through the ramp workers, a quiet realization that this was not a usual sight. The words they spoke were careful, almost cautious, as though naming the phenomenon might make it vanish. "Do you see that one?" "Asked it's there, hovering." The sound of their voices felt oddly distant beneath the low hum of engines and the chatter of radios, which carried the mundane news of flight schedules and taxiing planes. For a moment, the normalcy of the airport paused in acknowledgement of something unknown. Within minutes, more eyes turned skyward. Pilots in nearby cockpits leaned forward, their hands still on yokes, instinctively scanning for threats, for anything that could affect takeoff or landing. Supervisors stepped out of small offices, coffee cups still in hand, and craned their necks, faces slack with curiosity. Each observer had their own perspective, their own distance, their own slight variation in what they saw. Yet the story converged with a strange, quiet agreement. This was a disk metallic and gray, hovering with a serene defiance of movement. Some witnesses described a subtle wobble, a rotation so slight that it could have been dismissed by the inattentive eye. Yet the detail was there, a gentle counterclockwise spin, like a leaf turning in still air, a motion so delicate it almost belonged to nature itself. There were no wings, no rotors, no light trails, no exhaust puffed into the sky. Even the sound, the low, constant drone of the airport's engines and aircraft did not reveal anything. Silence had a weight to it. The disk made no sound, yet it was present with an insistence that could be felt as much as seen. Time, normally measured in the rhythm of departures and arrivals, began to stretch. Minutes lengthened into something that felt like a breath held as the disk hung beneath the overcast, refusing to leave. Observers noticed subtle differences in perception. Some claimed it was enormous, nearly 90 feet across, while others, looking from farther away, placed it at closer to 20. Angles and distances warped understanding, but no one questioned the reality of what they were witnessing. The disk existed, That alone was enough to make the evening different from every other day in their careers. Inside the cockpit of Flight 446, preparing for departure, the pilots peered through their windshield with widened eyes. Their instruments said nothing out of the ordinary. Yet outside, the sky presented something instruments could not measure a presence. One pilot leaned closer, tracing the disk with his gaze, feeling an unfamiliar tug at the edges of his thoughts, as though the world beyond the glass were quietly challenging everything he knew about flight, physics, and possibility. The co-pilot murmured softly, almost to herself, "It's just hovering." How their hands rested on the controls, tense, but careful, as if touching the yoke too firmly might shatter what they saw into disbelief. On the ramp, the first mechanic spoke into his radio, alerting supervisors. Words were chosen cautiously, framed in professional diction. "I'm seeing something unusual above gate C-17. It's metallic, disc-shaped, stationary." He did not shout. He did not panic. There was a quiet respect in his tone, a recognition that observation alone might be the most valuable act. Others nearby murmured their confirmations, careful not to disturb the fragile cohesion of what had already begun to feel sacred. Civilians outside the airport, too, noticed, from parking lots in distant streets. Curious eyes turned skyward. Some stopped mid-step, hands in pockets, heads tilted back. A few reached for cameras or phones, though in 2006 smartphones were less common, and not everyone had the opportunity to record. Still, the collective gaze created a ripple of attention, a subtle acknowledgement that this moment belonged to more than just those inside the terminal. Minutes passed, measured more by breath than by watch. Then, almost imperceptibly at first, the disk began to move. Not slowly, not with hesitation, but in a way that seemed inevitable. It accelerated upward, faster than any human expectation could accommodate, leaving behind a sudden, precise gap in the clouds, a perfect circle, as if cut with care, open to reveal the blue sky beyond. Witnesses felt a strange sense of awe and slight disorientation. Some experienced tingling on their skin, the faintest hum of energy, while others simply stared, mouths slightly open, as the disk ascended and vanished. The whole lingered in the sky, sharply defined, before the clouds slowly drifted back into place, knitting themselves together like a page turning in a story already told. Life below resumed. Airplanes prepared to taxi. Radios crackled with routine instructions. But something subtle had shifted. The world beneath the cloud ceiling felt simultaneously familiar and irrevocably altered. The day itself seemed to carry the memory of that hovering disk, a quiet pulse in the rhythm of ordinary motion. Witnesses tried to articulate what they saw. Words were difficult. Human language struggled to encompass the silent precision of the disk, the way it defied expectation. A baggage handler described it as like a smooth, oversized candy shell, noting the way the light played across its surface. Another observer likened its departure to a soft shockwave, a sensation that pricked hair on arms and left a faint thrill across the skin. Even those at a distance felt a subtle pull, the way the air seemed to hold its breath and then release, leaving a trace of wonder behind. Professional experience shaped the observations. These were people trained to notice, to differentiate, to respond. Their expertise lent credibility to the details. Each account, from pilots to ramp mechanics to civilians, converged on similar truths. The object's silence, its hovering presence, its metallic, disc-shaped form, and its sudden, almost imperceptible ascent. Discrepancies in size and perception existed, but they were explainable by distance and viewing angle, not imagination. Despite the extraordinary nature of what they witnessed, the atmosphere remained calm. No screams, no alarms, no emergency protocols triggered. This was not fear. It was quiet attention, a collective pause in routine. Even after the disk disappeared, the subtle echoes remained conversations, replaying in minds, soft questions forming, curiosity mixing with incredulity. How had it hovered so perfectly? How had it moved without sound? Why did it leave the clouds parted in such an impossibly clean circle? In the days and weeks that followed, memories of the event rippled quietly among the witnesses. They spoke in cautious tones, aware of the world outside their own experience. Reporting channels were navigated carefully. Some feared dismissal, others feared ridicule. Yet the core of what had occurred, the disk covering, the clouds parted, The sudden ascent remained. Undeniable, a gentle, persistent truth, lingering above the hum of the airport. The sky that evening had held a secret, and for a few moments, the people below had shared in its stillness. The world went on, as it always does, but the pause remained. It left questions that had no answers, experiences that could only be described in careful observation and quiet reflection. And in that space, between the ordinary and the extraordinary, a new awareness was born, that even in a place ruled by precision, order, and human expectation, something could appear that did not belong, something that simply existed, and then quietly departed, leaving the sky, and those who watched it subtly changed. And so, the night's calm held its secret, waiting for more eyes to look upward, and more stories to unfold. Chapter 2. An ordinary airport, the airport, in the fading afternoon light, seemed almost alive in its quiet rhythms. Steel and glass reflected the last hints of day, as if they were holding their breath, aware of every sound, every movement, every weight of human expectation pressing against the horizon. Travelers shuffled past gates, dragging their luggage with the soft scrape of wheels across polished floors, while airport staff moved with the quiet precision of rehearsed patterns. There was a comforting predictability to everything: the rise and fall of engines, the murmur of intercoms, the blinking lights marking pathways for planes and passengers alike. From the outside, one could almost think the airport was nothing more than a well-oiled machine. Yet inside, the life it contained was layered and intricate. Mechanics in reflective vests moved among parked aircraft, inspecting panels, checking fuel lines, exchanging subtle nods that communicated volumes without words. Supervisors walked briskly through corridors, tablets in hand, eyes scanning the horizon for schedules, delays, or the slightest deviation from expected flow. Pilots, briefcases tucked under arms, pass through gates with the practiced calm of those who live in the sky but are tethered to the earth. Every person carried their own weight of expectation and routine, unaware that, in a quiet corner of Concourse C, something extraordinary was about to pause everything. The overcast sky pressed gently above, a low ceiling of gray clouds that seemed to absorb sound and light, creating a muted atmosphere where every detail became more noticeable. The smell of warm jet fuel mingled with the faint scent of coffee and paper, grounding the hum of human activity with familiar textures. It was a day like any other, yet there was a subtle tension woven into the routine, a sense that the ordinary could suddenly tilt into something unexplainable if one simply looked a little closer. Ramp workers began their late afternoon routines, coordinating the departure of United Airlines Flight 446, a Boeing 737-500 preparing for Charlotte. Pushback tractors grumbled softly, tugs connected to the plane's nose wheel, and mechanics exchanged a few words over radios. The words themselves were casual, almost mundane, yet their tones carried awareness, honed over countless flights and countless days of managing metal, air, and gravity. And then one of them looked up. It was barely noticeable at first, the tilt of a head, the soft narrowing of eyes against the gray light. But once attention had shifted, the world seemed to hold a breath. Across Concourse, C mechanics, supervisors, and even pilots glimpsed it almost simultaneously. A disc, metallic and perfect, hovering above gate C-17. It was not part of any flight plan, not a weather balloon, not a blip on any radar they trusted. It simply existed, suspended as though waiting for someone to see it. There was no alarm, no rushing footsteps. The airport's rhythm continued, but beneath it, a soft tension spread. Observers exchanged glances, careful words flowing over radios and across walkie-talkies. "Are you seeing that?" one asked softly. "It's hovering," another replied. The exchange was hushed, deliberate, a mutual understanding that language could never fully capture what their eyes were confirming, even among professionals trained to assess aircraft and anomalies. The sight was unlike anything they had catalogued in manuals or internal procedures. The disc seemed ordinary and extraordinary at once. Its shape was simple as smooth, round, metallic form, but radiated a quiet insistence that made it feel alive. Some witnesses noted a faint wobble, a rotation almost imperceptible, that gave the edges a shimmering blur. like the afterimage of a slow-moving current in water. The light of the afternoon played across its surface, reflecting the gray of the clouds above, while the underside drank in the shadows of the busy ramp below. In the presence of this object, every ordinary detail, the hum of the air conditioning, the faint clatter of luggage, the distant roar of an engine taxiing, seemed to fade into secondary importance, as though the airport itself had paused to acknowledge something beyond comprehension. Pilots inside a nearby Boeing 777 noticed it as they taxied slowly on taxiway Alpha, 5,000 feet from the gate. Their eyes lifted from instruments and runways to the sky above Concourse C. They observed the disk silently, aware of how unusual it was to see an object in controlled airspace behaving in a way that no known aircraft could. No wings, no lights, no exhaust. Just a presence that refused the natural rules they had internalized through years of flying. One pilot pressed a finger lightly against the windshield, almost unconsciously, as if tracing the outline might help them understand. "It doesn't make sense," a voice whispered, though loud enough for only the nearest crew member to hear, and yet the calmness remained. The object's silence seemed to invite quiet observation, not panic. Meanwhile, supervisors and mechanics closer to Gate C-17 observed it 4 minutes on end. Some described its size as almost 88 feet across, others closer to 20, depending on perspective and distance. All agreed on its metallic gray color, its disc-like form, and its refusal to make any sound. One supervisor noted the way it seemed to interact with the clouds, pushing against them, standing apart as though the atmosphere itself recognized the anomaly. Another remarked on a subtle sense of energy, a tingling at the skin that left an impression of being physically acknowledged by something beyond human comprehension. In the parking lot outside the airport, a former reporter with aviation experience noticed the object from nearly a mile away. He stopped, hands in pockets, his gaze locked on the disk as it hovered. For him, the moment carried an awareness unlike any news story he had chased. The ordinary world, the cars passing, the streetlights, the murmurs of people moving toward terminals faded into soft background noise. What he saw was not dangerous, not frightening, just impossibly quiet and impossibly deliberate. For 13 minutes, maybe 14, he watched as the disk hovered, sometimes shifting slightly, other times standing perfectly still, until the final moment when it shot upward and punched a clean, circular hole in the cloud ceiling. The hole itself remained for several minutes, a perfectly defined portal of blue in a sky otherwise muted in gray. Observers reported the lingering impression of its presence, the soft energy that seemed to hum across distance. For some, the hair on their arms lifted. Others felt a subtle vibration through the soles of their shoes, as if the airport's concrete had registered the motion of something beyond known physics. And then, just as quietly as it had arrived, the disk was gone. The hole slowly closed, the clouds drifting back into their previous positions, the ordinary rhythm of the airport resuming as though nothing had happened. Yet nothing truly returned to normal. Pilots continued to taxi and prepare for departure, but their thoughts lingered, soft questions forming with no urgent need for answers. Ramp mechanics returned to their duties, yet each step felt slightly altered, conscious now of the possibility of anomalies, of events that do not follow the rules they have been trained to follow. Supervisors continued to monitor schedules, yet the disk lingered in memory, a silent presence that reminded them how fragile assumptions can be. Even in the quiet corners, conversations unfolded in hushed tones. Observers recounted shapes and sizes, angles, and behaviors, sharing details while carefully avoiding speculation. Every word was measured, every sentence tempered by the awareness that ordinary language could never fully capture extraordinary reality. Observers found themselves describing not just what they saw, but how it made them feel: the gentle pause in time, the subtle energy that pressed against skin, and thought the awe that arose, not from fear, but from the sheer unexpectedness of presence. The airport, in its vastness, had witnessed something that was not meant to be catalogued in manuals, or assigned a flight number, or explained by weather reports. It existed outside the schedule, outside the clock, outside the expectations of every person who walked its halls. And yet, for those who had looked up, it left a quiet, lasting impression. That evening, the ordinary airport had become a stage for something extraordinary, and the witnesses, intentionally or not, had become silent participants in a moment that stretched beyond the mundane. Even weeks later, as news slowly trickled through internal reports and cautious conversations, The memory of that afternoon remained vivid. It was not a story shouted from rooftops, nor a sensational headline. It was a soft, insistent whisper carried in memory, a reminder that even in the most controlled, ordered environments, there are moments when the sky pauses, and we are invited to notice. The ordinary airport, for all its scheduled movements and trained precision, had briefly yielded to something entirely new. And in the stillness, the people below had found a shared awareness that the world is larger, stranger, and more beautiful than the sum of its routines. The gentle hum of engines, the soft roll of luggage, the muted chatter of passengers, they all continued. But now threaded through them was the memory of silence, of presence, of a sky that held its breath and asked humans to do the same. It was a day of routine in the schedules and the terminals, yet no one who looked up would ever forget that the ordinary could, at any moment, reveal the extraordinary. And in that realization, a quiet curiosity settled, like dust motes drifting in a beam of sunlight, waiting for the next eyes to notice. And as the airport returned to its familiar rhythm, the quiet wonder lingered, hinting that not all truths announce themselves immediately. Chapter 3. Something above the gate. It began without drama. No alarms, no sudden hush, just a moment when someone looked up and didn't look away. Above gate C-17, suspended between metal and cloud, something unfamiliar rested in the air, not moving, not arriving, not leaving. Simply there. At first glance, it didn't demand attention. It didn't glow or roar or announce itself. It hovered quietly, as if it had always belonged in that place, as if the sky had briefly misplaced an object and set it down above the terminal to rest. A ramp worker noticed it first, not because it was loud or fast, but because it wasn't. His eyes had followed a habit learned over years of work, scanning aircraft, equipment, weather, motion, and then his gaze stopped. He squinted slightly, adjusting his stance, one hand resting on cold metal railing. Something didn't fit. It wasn't a plane. It wasn't a helicopter. It wasn't anything he recognized. The object hung there, metallic and smooth, its surface dull like brushed aluminum left out in the weather. The colors shifted gently depending on where you stood, darker underneath, lighter near the top, almost blending into the gray ceiling above. Its shape was round, but not flat. Thick at the center, tapered at the edges, like a coin softened by time, or a shape borrowed from somewhere else entirely. He didn't shout. He didn't panic. He reached for his radio instead, thumb pressing the button with a touch lighter than usual. "Hey," he said, carefully. "You seeing this?" Across the ramp, another worker paused mid-task. Then another. Someone leaned back against a tug. A supervisor stopped walking. Heads tilted upward, one by one, like a quiet wave moving through the gate area. No one rushed closer. No one backed away. They just stood there, watching. The object didn't react to being seen. It didn't blink or flash or shift suddenly. It remained steady, hovering over the gate with an ease that felt almost intentional. There was no visible means of support, no cables, no exhaust, no sound. Even the usual background noise of the airport, the engines, the carts, the distant announcements seemed to thin around it, as if the air itself had grown more attentive. Someone muttered that it looked like a disc. Someone else said it reminded them of a thick oval. Another quietly compared it to a smooth stone balanced on invisible water. Descriptions varied, but the certainty did not. This was solid, real, present. Inside the cockpit of a nearby aircraft, a pilot noticed the way others were standing still. That alone was unusual. Airports rarely pause. He followed their gaze and felt his breath slow. The object stood out clearly against the clouds, its edges sharper than anything natural, its stillness unsettling in its precision. Years of flight training had taught him what belonged in the sky and what didn't. This didn't. He leaned forward slightly, scanning for details. No markings. No windows, no seams. Just a unified surface that reflected the world faintly, like it was aware of its surroundings, but not part of them. The pilot glanced at his co-pilot. Neither spoke at first. There are moments when language lags behind observation. "Do you hear anything?" one finally asked. They listened. Nothing. No hum. No vibration. No shift in pressure. The object was silent in a way that felt deliberate, as if sound itself had been excluded from its presence. That silence pressed gently against the senses, making the smallest noisista click of a switch. The rustle of fabric feels suddenly louder. On Degrun, the ramp worker felt a strange sensation along his arms. Not fear, not excitement, just awareness. The kind that makes your skin tighten slightly, as if your body has noticed something your mind hasn't fully processed yet. He shifted his weight, eyes locked upward, the radio still warm in his hand. "How long has it been there?" someone asked. No one knew. Time felt different beneath it. Minutes stretched. Tasks waited. Schedules soft. The object hovered, unbothered by human routines, unconcerned with gates and timetables. It didn't drift with the wind. It didn't wobble like a balloon. If it moved at all, it was with a subtle, almost curious adjustment, a slow, slight rotation that blurred its edges, just enough to make the eye question itself. Someone described it later as looking alive, not because it behaved like a creature, but because it felt responsive, aware, as if it was observing the observers. In the parking lot beyond the terminal, a man stood beside his car, keys forgotten in his hand. He had planned to be somewhere else by now. But the sky had interrupted him. He watched the object from a distance, noting how it seemed unchanged, by perspective still, clearly defined, still quietly dominant. Other people nearby had stopped too. Conversations faded. Phones were raised hesitantly, then lowered again. This was 2006. Cameras were slower. Moments slipped through fingers more easily. Then he felt a faint tingling along his neck, like the air had been charged without warning. The feeling wasn't unpleasant, just noticeable, as if the atmosphere itself had leaned closer. Back near the gate, the supervisor picked up the phone and called the tower. The words "flying disc" felt strange, even as they left her mouth. She half expected laughter, and she got it. A joke, a pause, a dismissal softened by humor. But she kept her eyes on the object as she listened, unwilling to look away. The disc remained. 5 minutes passed. Maybe more. Workers later argued about the duration, but in that moment, time had loosened its grip. The object's patience was unsettling. It wasn't in a hurry. It wasn't hiding. It simply occupied the space, hovering above one of the busiest airports in the world, as if daring anyone to explain it. Then, without warning, everything changed. There was no build-up, no visible preparation. One moment, the object was still and the next. It moved. Not forward, not sideways up. It accelerated with a smoothness that defied instinct. No lurch, no sound, just an immediate, decisive ascent that pulled the eye upward before the mind could catch up. In seconds, less than seconds, it crossed the distance to the cloud layer above, punching through it as if the clouds were fabric. A perfect hole opened in the overcast. Clean, circular, precise. Blue sky appeared where none had been moments before. People gasped not loudly, but together, a shared intake of breath. Some felt the air shift. Others felt it in their bodies, a brief vibration, a tingling along the scalp, the sensation of standing near a powerful electrical current without touching it. And then the object was gone. No trail, no echo, just absence. The hole in the clouds lingered, a quiet scar in the sky. Sunlight spilled through it, illuminating the tarmac in a sudden, gentle brightness that felt almost unreal. The clouds slowly drifted back, closing the opening as if nothing had pierced them at all. But the witnesses knew better. Silence settled again, different this time. Heavier, thoughtful. People looked at each other. Nods were exchanged, a few quiet words. No one cheered. No one ran. The airport resumed its rhythm cautiously, like someone returning to a room where a strange visitor had just left. Work continued. Flights departed, but something had shifted. Those who saw it carried the moment with them, folded neatly into memory, waiting for explanation. Waiting for permission to speak, waiting for the sky to pause again. And though the clouds returned to gray, the question remained soft, persistent, impossible to ignore. What had just been above the gate? And as the sky closed itself again, the questions quietly began to open. Chapter 4. The moment everyone felt it. After the sky sealed itself again, the airport did not rush back to normal all at once. It eased into motion, like a sleeper waking slowly, uncertain whether the dream had truly ended. People returned to their tasks, but their movements carried a slight hesitation now. A baggage cart rolled past, gate C-17, its wheels humming softly, yet the sound felt sharper than before. A plane's engine spooled up in the distance, but instead of blending into the background, it stood out, too loud, too mechanical. Even the intercom announcements seemed to arrive with more weight, as though every voice was speaking into a space that had just been occupied by something else. Those who had seen the object didn't immediately talk about it. They stood quietly, letting the moment settle. Some stared at the clouds, half expecting the hole to reopen. Others looked down at the concrete beneath their boots, grounding themselves in something solid and familiar. And then there were these sensations. One rampage and flexed his fingers, surprised by the faint prickling that still lingered along his arms. It felt like the aftermath of touching static electricity, except there had been no spark. Another rubbed the back of his neck, trying to shake the feeling that the air had briefly thickened around him, as if the space itself had been disturbed and was now slowly returning to rest. Inside the cockpit of the 737 at gate C-17, the first officer sat quietly for a moment longer than necessary, before reaching for the next checklist. His hand hovered above the panel, not because he'd forgotten what to do, but because his attention was still somewhere above the clouds. He finally exhaled, a breath he had rarely said that he'd been holding, and forced his focus back to the instruments. Yet even as procedures resumed, the memory lingered in his peripheral awareness. The object had been too clear, too deliberate, too present. A supervisor near the gate found herself replaying the moment of ascent in her mind. She remembered the way it moved, not like something pushed or pulled, but like something deciding. There had been no struggle against gravity, no hint of effort, just choice, followed by motion. That detail, more than the shape or size, unsettled her. Machines didn't behave that way. As she walked toward the operations office, she noticed other staff glancing at one another, eyes briefly meeting before drifting away. There was a quiet recognition in those looks, a shared understanding that something unusual had passed through their ordinary world. No one needed to ask, "Did you see that?" The answer lived in their expressions. Outside the terminal, in the parking lot, the former reporter remained where he was, long after the sky returned to gray. His heart rate had slowed, but the sensation on his skin hadn't completely faded. It felt as though the air itself had brushed against him, leaving behind a trace. He tried to frame the experience, the way he had framed countless stories. Before who, what, when, where. But something resisted being arranged into neat columns of fact. This wasn't just something he'd witnessed. It was something that had passed through him. Back on the ramp, someone finally broke the silence. "Did you feel that?" The baggage handler asked quietly. A few heads turned. A pause followed. Then a nod. "Yeah," someone else said. "Like pressure or energy." No one laughed. No one dismissed it. The words were accepted and left to hang there, unchallenged. In a place governed by protocols and explanations, the lack of immediate answers felt strange, almost disorienting. Yet there was comfort in knowing others had felt it too. The airport's systems, meanwhile, showed nothing unusual. Radar screens remained calm. Weather displays showed the same overcast layer they always had. From a technical standpoint, nothing had happened. And yet, on the ground, among the people who lived and worked beneath that sky, everything felt slightly altered. A mechanic leaned against a railing and looked up once more. The clouds were closing ranks, smoothing themselves into a uniform gray. He wondered how something could move through them so cleanly, leaving such a precise opening behind. He'd seen aircraft punch holes in cloud layers before, but those holes were messy, ragged, temporary scars accompanied by sound and motion. This had been different. Intentional. Controlled. He tried to imagine the force required to do that to part clouds without turbulence, without chaos. The thought drifted away before it could settle into a conclusion. Inside the terminal, passengers who hadn't seen the object continued their journeys, unaware that anything out of the ordinary had occurred. They checked their phones, adjusted backpacks, scanned departure boards. Life flowed on, indifferent, and yet a few people near the windows lingered longer than usual, gazes lifted, drawn by something they couldn't name. It was as if the airport itself remembered. The air felt charged in subtle ways. Sounds seemed to echo just a little longer. Light reflected differently off metal surfaces, catching edges it hadn't caught before. These were small things, easily dismissed, but to those who had watched the object depart, they felt connected, like ripples spreading outward from a single, silent impact. Later, when some of the witnesses tried to describe the experience to colleagues who hadn't been present, they struggled. Words like disc and metallic felt insufficient, describing the sensations of pause, the awareness. The shared stillness proved even harder. One mechanic gestured vaguely upward as he spoke, his hand tracing the invisible path the object had taken. It wasn't just seeing it, he said slowly. It was like the whole place noticed. That idea lingered. The whole place noticed. O'Hare International Airport was designed to manage movement, arrivals, departures, transfers. It was a hub of constant change, and yet, for a brief span of minutes, something had arrived that didn't fit into that system. It hadn't checked in. It hadn't requested clearance. It hadn't followed any of the invisible rules that governed the sky. And still, it had been there. As evening approached, the light began to soften, and the memory of the object took on a dreamlike quality. Some wondered if, with enough time, they might question themselves. Had it really been that clear? Had it really been silent? The mind has a way of smoothing over sharp edges, but then there were the others, the ones who still felt the echo in their bodies, the ones who could close their eyes and see the hole in the clouds as vividly as if it were still open. For them, doubt didn't settle easily. A pilot finishing his shift later that night found himself standing by a window, watching aircraft lights blink against the darkening sky. He thought about how many times he had trusted instruments over instinct, data over sensation. And yet, that afternoon, his senses had told him something important before any instrument ever could. Whatever it was, it had been real. Not real in the way rumors are real. Not real in the way stories grow over time. Real in the immediate, undeniable way of something that occupies space and then leaves it changed. The airport carried on, of course. It always does. Flights departed on schedule. New passengers arrived. The sky darkened, then cleared in places. But beneath the routine, a quiet undercurrent remained. A feeling that something had brushed close to the world, a sense that the boundary between the known and the unknown had thinned, just for a moment. And for those who had stood beneath that gate, who had felt the air shift and the sky open, the memory did not fade into the background. It settled gently, waiting to be questioned, waiting to be challenged, waiting to be understood. Because once you've felt the sky move around you, once you've sensed that the world may be larger than its explanations, it's difficult to return fully to the comfort of certainty. The airport slept that night, under a familiar canopy of stars and clouds. But somewhere in its vast structure, the moment lingered quiet, unresolved, and alive with possibility. And quietly, beneath the steady flow of departures and arrivals, the questions began to gather weight. Chapter 5. Quiet Conversations. As evening settled over the airport, the light shifted into softer tones, and the long shadows of terminals stretched across the ground. The rush of the day eased into a steadier rhythm, one that felt more reflective than hurried. Planes still arrived and departed, of course, but there was a gentler quality to the movement now, as if the entire place had exhaled. In break rooms tucked away behind secured doors, small groups of workers gathered without quite meaning to. Someone poured coffee that had gone lukewarm. Someone else leaned against a counter, arms crossed, eyes unfocused. The conversations that unfolded were not loud or animated. They were low and careful, shaped by uncertainty and shared experience. "Did you notice how still it was?" one mechanic said, his voice barely louder than the hum of a vending machine. Another nodded slowly. That's what got me. Everything else moves. Even balloons drift. That thing didn't. They spoke in fragments at first, testing words the way one tests unfamiliar ground. No one rushed to conclusions. They described angles, distances, colors. They compared memories, gently correcting one another, not to argue, but to understand. Each detail added weight, forming a clearer picture without ever fully resolving into something explainable. A supervisor joined them, setting her tablet aside. She listened more than she spoke, her expression thoughtful. When she finally added her voice, it was to mention the cloud opening again. I've never seen anything leave a hole like that, she said. It was clean. The room fell quiet for a moment, as if everyone were picturing the same sky at once. Elsewhere, pilots finishing their shifts crossed paths in hallways and lounges. A nod here, a raised eyebrow there, a brief pause that invited conversation without demanding it. Some chose not to talk at all, carrying the moment inward instead. Others spoke carefully, aware of how easily such stories could be misunderstood. I know what I saw, one pilot said softly to another as they waited near the exit, and I know what it wasn't. That was enough. Outside the airport, the former reporter sat at his desk at home, long after dark, a notebook opened in front of him. The pages remained mostly blank. He had written stories his entire life, but this one resisted being pinned down. Facts alone felt insufficient. The experience had texture, weight, atmosphere. How do you write about something that doesn't want to be contained? He replayed the moment of ascent in his mind, the sudden upward motion, the opening in the clouds, the sensation along his skin. Each time, the memory felt intact, untouched by doubt. That steadiness reassured him. Whatever questions might come later, the moment itself remained solid. Back at the airport, a baggage handler walked the long route to his car under the glow of parking lot lights. He glanced up more than once, half expecting to see something waiting there. The sky offered nothing but darkness and scattered stars. Still, his steps felt lighter, as if he were carrying a secret that had shifted his sense of scale. At home, he mentioned the incident to his partner in the simplest terms. Something strange happened today, he said. At work. She listened, sensing there was more behind the words. He didn't try to explain everything. He didn't need to. The experience belonged to him in a way that felt personal, almost intimate. Some things don't ask to be shared widely. Over the next few days, the conversations continued quietly. They happened in passing, in break rooms, in cockpits, in the brief moments between tasks. Each time, the story stayed remarkably consistent. No one embellished. No one exaggerated. If anything, they trimmed their descriptions, careful not to invite skepticism. And yet, the questions grew. Why there? Why then? Why hover? The airport's official channels remained silent. No alerts, no memos, nothing to suggest that anything out of the ordinary had occurred. From the outside, O'Hare was business as usual. Inside, among those who had looked up, there was a growing awareness that silence can be as revealing as explanation. One mechanic tried to find comparisons online, scrolling through images and descriptions late at night. Balloons, aircraft, atmospheric effects, none of them fit. He closed his laptop feeling both frustrated and strangely calm. The lack of answers didn't disturb him as much as he'd expected. Instead, it left space to wonder. A pilot attending recurrent training later that week found himself momentarily distracted during a discussion of airspace protocols. The instructor spoke about control, about predictability, about safety margins, all important, all necessary. And yet, the pilot couldn't help thinking about how easily something unknown had entered that carefully managed sky. It wasn't a threatening thought. It was humbling. In the control tower, a few controllers quietly revisited recordings and logs, not because they'd been instructed to, but because curiosity lingered. They found little of interest, no obvious anomalies, no clear markers. The systems had done what they were designed to do. And yet, the memory of that casual radio comment, the offhand mention of a UFO, returned with new weight. Sometimes, it's the smallest remarks that echo the longest. As the days passed, the initial shock softened into contemplation. The experience became less about what it appeared and more about what it suggested, that the world might still hold moments that resist categorization, that not everything announces itself with noise or spectacle. Some things arrive quietly, observe, and depart, leaving only questions behind. For many of the witnesses, sleep came differently now. Not restlessly, but thoughtfully. They lay awake for a few extra minutes, watching shadows shift across ceilings, listening to familiar nighttime sounds. The memory of the object hovered at the edge of thought, not intrusive, just present. What if it returns? What if it doesn't? What if this was enough? In these quiet moments, fear never took root. Instead, there was a sense of being briefly included in something larger. Not chosen, exactly, but noticed. That feeling carried a strange comfort, as though the universe had leaned close, whispered nothing, and moved on. One evening, a supervisor stood outside her home, looking up at the sky as dusk faded. Planes traced familiar paths overhead, lights blinking rhythmically. She watched them with renewed appreciation. The sky felt less like a ceiling now, and more like an open question. At O'Hare, the routines held. They always would. Airports thrive on repetition and reliability, but beneath the structure, something subtle had changed. The people who worked there carried a shared memory, unspoken but intact. A quiet bond formed, not through excitement or fear, but through recognition. They had seen something together, and though the world around them continued uninterrupted, the questions they carried did not demand immediate answers. They waited patiently, like the object had waited above the gate, calm and silent. Observant, because sometimes the most meaningful conversations are the ones spoken softly, in fragments, in pauses, and sometimes the most lasting mysteries are the ones that don't insist on being solved. They simply remain. And as the days unfolded, the quiet curiosity refused to fade, gently pulling the moment forward into something larger. Chapter 6, The Weight of Silence. By the sixth day, the moment no longer felt new, but it hadn't faded either. Instead, it settled into the background of daily life, like a low, steady hum you only notice when you stop to listen. At O'Hare, the morning shift began, as it always did. Coffee brie-wet. Screens flickered to life. Radios crackled with routine instructions. Everything worked exactly as designed. And yet, among those who had witnessed the object, there was a shared awareness that something unseen lingered just beneath the surface of normality. Silence had taken on weight. Not the awkward kind, nor the fearful kind, but a deliberate, almost respectful quiet. No official briefings had come, no inquiries, no dismissals. The absence of response felt intentional, though no one could say by whom. It was as if the event existed in a narrow space between acknowledgement and denial. A ground controller reviewed airspace charts during a slow interval, her eyes tracing familiar corridors in the sky. She knew every deviation, every exception, every emergency procedure. None of them applied. What they'd seen had not broken the rules, it had ignored them. That distinction mattered. In a maintenance hangar, a veteran technician paused mid-task, wrench in hand, staring at the smooth curve of an aircraft fuselage. Decades of work had taught him to respect engineering, precision, human ingenuity. But now, a quiet thought followed him everywhere. If it wasn't ours, then whose was it? He didn't feel threatened by the idea. If anything, it made the world feel less finished. Across the city, the former reporter finally began to write not an article, not exos, but a personal record. He described only what he knew for certain: the timing, the position, the movement. He avoided conclusions, avoided speculation. The words felt heavier than usual, as though committing them to paper made the experience more real. When he finished, he closed the notebook and didn't look at it again. That evening, a pilot sat on his balcony, watching aircraft blink across the sky. He identified them automatically: altitude, direction, likely destination. Then he stopped himself. For years, the sky had been a system to him. Predictable, controlled, safe. Now it felt vast again. The realization didn't unsettle him. It restored something he hadn't known he'd lost. Online, scattered discussions had begun to surface: vague posts, cautious language, Nothing concrete. A few screenshots. A few rumors. They gained little traction. Without official confirmation, the stories struggled to take shape. And perhaps that was the point. Not everything wants to become a headline. Some experiences resist being turned into content. In a quiet moment between flights, a controller caught herself smiling faintly. The memory of the object no longer spiked her pulse. Instead, it brought calm. Whatever it had been, it hadn't demanded attention. It hadn't interfered. It had simply existed confident, unhurried, unconcerned with being understood. That restraint felt meaningful. Late that night, clouds rolled in again, thick and layered. A baggage handler stepped outside during a break and looked up, remembering the opening in the sky from days before. This time, nothing appeared. The clouds remained whole, indifferent. Still, he stayed a little longer than necessary, just in case. The strangest part, many of them realized, wasn't what they'd seen but how it had changed the way they looked afterward. At the sky, at their routines, at the idea that certainty was something humans constructed, not something the universe owed them. There was comfort in that, too, because if something unknown could pass through one of the most monitored airspaces in the world without disruption, without aggression, without explanation, then maybe mystery itself wasn't a threat. Maybe it was an invitation. As the city slept, planes continued their paths, lights blinking steadily, lines drawn and redrawn across the dark. And far above them more, perhaps far beyond the possibility, remained that something else was watching. Not hiding, not revealing itself, just observing. And in that shared, unspoken understanding, those who had witnessed the moment carried on, not waiting for answers, not demanding clarity, content to know that for a brief time, the silence had spoken and they had listened. Chapter 7. Patterns Beneath the Ordinary. By the 7th day, the world had fully returned to its familiar rhythm, or at least, it appeared to have. Traffic moved in steady lines. Departures lifted on time. The airport breathed in its usual mechanical cadence, every system humming as if nothing unusual had ever slipped through its airspace. To anyone watching from the outside, O'Hare was simply doing what it had always done. But for those who had seen the sky open, something subtle had shifted. It wasn't fear. It wasn't excitement, either. It was a heightened awareness, a gentle tuning of the senses, as though a dial had been turned slightly to the right. They noticed pauses where they hadn't before. Gaps. Patterns hiding beneath routine. A radar specialist leaned back in a chair during a quiet stretch and let her eyes drift across the screen. The green arcs and symbols moved with familiar precision. She trusted them. She had built her career on trusting them. And yet, she now found herself wondering about the moments between the sweeps, those infinitesimal slivers of time, where nothing was captured, nothing recorded, what passed through those spaces. She shook her head lightly and smiled at herself. The thought wasn't disruptive. It was curious, almost playful, like noticing a hidden detail in a painting you'd walked past your entire life. In a nearby office, an operations supervisor reviewed incident logs from the previous week. The anomaly was there, reduced to dry language and technical phrasing. Timestamps, weather conditions, equipment checks. Everything neat, everything contained, but the experience itself refused to stay contained. He remembered the way the sky had looked, how the clouds parted without drama, without turbulence. How the object had held its position as though gravity were optional. There had been no rush in its movement, no urgency. It had behaved like something deeply familiar with its surroundings. That detail lingered. Across town, the former reporter took a long walk through a park he'd visited hundreds of times before. The trees stood still in the mild breeze. Children laughed in the distance. A plane passed overhead, its sound fading as it climbed. He stopped and watched until it disappeared. For years, he'd chased stories that demanded to be told. Stories that clawed their way into the public eye. This one was different. It didn't demand anything. It waited. And that patience unsettled him more than chaos ever had. He wondered how many other moments like this existed, quiet intersections between the known and the unknown that never became stories at all. At the airport, a flight attendant adjusted her uniform before boarding and caught her reflection in a darkened window. She looked the same felt to Same, and yet she carried an odd sense of gratitude she couldn't quite explain. During the sighting, she'd felt small, not insignificant, but placed, as if the universe had briefly reminded her that it was larger than schedules and safety briefings and seat numbers. The feeling had stayed. Online, the conversation continued to flicker and fade. A few aviation forums speculated carefully. A few amateur analysts tried to reconstruct the moment from limited data. The tone remained restrained. No hysteria. No certainty. One post, buried deep in a thread, stood out for its simplicity. Whatever it was, it didn't need us to see it. That idea spread quietly. In a break room, 2 ground crew members sat with their phones face down between them, talking about anything but the event. Yet both glanced upward when a low cloud rolled past the window. Neither mentioned it. They didn't need to. Some experiences create a shared language without words. That evening, the pilot returned to his balcony. The sky was clear this time. Stars scattered unevenly across the dark. He leaned on the railing and breathed in the cool air, letting his eyes wander without trying to categorize what he saw. For the first time in years, he wasn't scanning for traffic. He wasn't calculating distances or altitudes. He was simply looking. And in that stillness, a quiet realization formed. If something unknown could appear and vanish without disruption, without harm, without announcement, then perhaps the universe wasn't as rigid as training manuals suggested. Perhaps it was layered, flexible, filled with systems operating alongside ours. Unnoticed, not because they were hidden, but because we rarely thought to look. The thought didn't frighten him. It softened something inside. Late into the night, a controller finished her shift and stepped outside. The air carried the distant sound of engines and the faint glow of city lights. She looked up, just once, then headed home. She didn't expect to see anything. Expectation, she'd learned, wasn't required. As the days continued, the event at O'Hare began to feel less like an isolated incident and more like a doorway, one that had opened briefly, then closed, leaving behind a lingering awareness of what lay beyond. Not answers, possibilities. And quietly, without coordination or intent, those who had been there began to live with that awareness. They didn't speak of it often. They didn't seek validation. They simply carried on, noticing, more listening longer, accepting that some patterns only reveal themselves when you stop insisting on explanations. Somewhere beyond flight paths and cloud layers, the unknown remained unchanged, unbothered, unconcerned with human timelines, and down below, life continued its steady motion, now threaded with a gentle understanding. The ordinary was only one layer of reality, and it was no longer the only one that mattered. Chapter 8. The Quiet Turning. By the 8th day, the question had changed. It was no longer what was it. It had become, why did it feel like it mattered? Nothing new had appeared in the sky. No follow-up sightings. No confirmations. No denials. And yet, among those who had witnessed the moment, something continued to unfold slowly, almost invisibly, like a tide that turns long before the shoreline notices. At O'Hare, routines continued with practiced ease. Gates opened and closed. Luggage moved along conveyor belts with rhythmic precision. Voices came and went through headsets, clipped and professional, each instruction flowing into the next. But beneath it all, there was a gentle shift in how people moved through their hours. A senior air traffic manager stood near a wide window, overlooking the runways, hands folded behind his back. He'd spent most of his life making decisions that left no room for doubt. Clearances had to be right. Timelines had to align. Lives depended on certainty. Yet now, when he looked out at the sky, he no longer felt the urge to measure it. He remembered the object's stillness, not frozen, not stalled, but settled, as if it had found exactly where it wanted to be, and had no interest in proving anything to anyone. That memory had begun to influence him in unexpected ways. He found himself pausing before responding to emails, listening more closely during briefings, allowing silence to linger just a second longer before filling it. The change was subtle, but it was real. In a quiet corner of the airport, a cleaner worked methodically, pushing her cart along polished floors, their reflected ceiling lights like distant stars. She hadn't spoken about the sighting to anyone. She hadn't needed to. The image lived comfortably in her mind, unchallenged. For her, the moment had felt oddly personal. She'd grown up believing the world was already fully explained, that everything mysterious had either been solved or dismissed. But watching the sky part without sound, without announcement, had loosened that belief. Now, as she worked, she found herself wondering how many truths existed beyond human attention, not hidden, just unobserved. The thought didn't trouble her. It made the night shifts feel less lonely. Elsewhere in the city, the former reporter sat at his kitchen table, laptop open but untouched. The document on the screen remained blank. He wasn't stuck. Simply didn't he know how to write something that refused to become a story. Every version he attempted felt wrong, too dramatic, too skeptical, too certain. What he'd experienced didn't belong to any of those categories. So instead, he closed the laptop and opened the window. Cold air slipped inside, carrying distant city sounds. Somewhere far off, an aircraft climbed, its lights blinking steadily as it disappeared into cloud. He watched until there was nothing left to see. And in that emptiness, a realization surfaced. Not every truth wants to be broadcast. Some are meant to be lived quietly, reshaping the edges of perception rather than the headlines. At the airport, a young trainee sat with her instructor during a slow shift. She hesitated, then finally asked a question she'd been carrying for days. "Do you ever think," she said carefully, "that we only notice what we expect to notice?" Her instructor considered this. "Eyes still on the screen." "All the time," he replied. "That's why surprises exist." She nodded, satisfied not because the answer explained anything, but because it acknowledged the question. That evening, clouds gathered low again, softening the horizon. A ground crew member paused mid-step and glanced upward, half expecting the sky to part once more. It didn't. Still, the act of looking felt meaningful in itself. Across the city, quiet conversations unfolded between partners, between friends, between people who rarely spoke about anything abstract at all. The words stayed cautious, gentle. No one rushed toward conclusions. What if, someone would say, then stop? What if another would echo, letting the idea drift unfinished between them? The unfinished parts seemed important. Late at night, as lights dimmed across the terminals, a controller finished her shift and sat alone for a moment before leaving. She removed her headset and placed it carefully on the desk, as she'd done thousands of times before. But this time, she didn't rise immediately. She thought about how the object had appeared without permission and vanished without explanation. How it hadn't disrupted anything, hadn't demanded belief, attention, or response. It had simply been that. Restraint stayed with her. She realized that whatever had passed through the sky had changed her relationship with uncertainty. Where once it felt like a problem to solve, it now felt like a space to respect, a space where curiosity could exist without pressure. As she stood and headed for the exit, she glanced once more at the darkened sky beyond the glass. Nothing moved except the slow drift of clouds. And yet, the sky no longer felt empty. It felt layered, filled with pathways humans had yet to name. Stories still unfolding beyond awareness. By the 8th day, the event at O'Hare no longer felt like a question demanding answers. It felt like a quiet turning point, a reminder that reality wasn't a closed system, and understanding wasn't always immediate. Some awakenings arrive without sound. They don't announce themselves. They simply change the way you look. And once that shift happens, the world never quite returns to its previous shape. Chapter 9. When listening changes you by the 9th day. The city felt louder and quieter at the same time. The engines still roared. Trains still rattled through their tunnels. Voices still filled offices, terminals, and streets. Nothing in the world had lowered its volume. Yet for those who had witnessed the moment at O'Hare, sound itself seemed to carry more meaning. They had learned how to listen, not just with their ears, but with patience. At the airport, a night controller adjusted her chair and leaned slightly closer to the console, not because anything demanded attention, but because she no longer rushed the empty moments. The spaces between transmissions felt alive now, filled with possibility rather than absence. Silence, she'd discovered, wasn't nothing. It was a pause where something could arrive. She remembered the object hovering without sound, as if noise were optional. No engines. No disturbance. Just presence. That memory had changed how she experienced every quiet stretch afterward. In a maintenance corridor, a mechanic tightened a bolt and paused to feel the vibration settle through the metal. He'd spent decades listening for problems, rattles, hums, irregular rhythms that signaled failure. But lately, he listened differently. He noticed the steadiness of things, the way systems held together, the way balance existed not because of force, but because of alignment. The object hadn't forced the sky to accept it. It had aligned with it. That thought followed him as he finished his shift. Across town, the former reporter met an old colleague for coffee. They talked about work, about deadlines, about stories that came and went. Like whether, eventually, the conversation slowed. You ever feel like the colleague began, then stopped? He stirred his coffee instead. The reporter smiled. Yeah, he said softly. I think so. They didn't explain further. They didn't need to. Some realizations only make sense to those who've been changed by them. Back at the airport, a pilot preparing for departure ran through his checklist with the same precision he always had. But when he reached the final line, he paused just long enough to look out the cockpit window. The sky stretched wide and dark beyond the runway lights. For the first time in years, he wasn't thinking about where he was going. He was thinking about where he was. The object's appearance had reminded him that flight wasn't just a profession, it was a relationship with something vast and ancient. Humans hadn't conquered the sky. They'd learned how to move through it politely. That distinction mattered. Online discussions had grown quieter but more thoughtful. The loud voices had moved on to fresher topics. What remained were slow conversations, careful language, people choosing words that left room for uncertainty. One message stood out. If something wanted attention, it would have stayed. The idea lingered. In a quiet apartment, a baggage handler sat on the floor with his back against the couch. Lights off, city glow filtering through the window. He wasn't meditating. He wasn't searching for meaning. He was simply being still. And in that stillness, he realized the object hadn't taken anything from him. It had given something permission to pause without explanation. That gift felt rare. At O'Hare, a supervisor watched a line of planes taxi with perfect spacing, each movement measured and controlled. For years, she'd believed order came from command. Now, she wondered if order also came from trust. The sky hadn't panicked when the object appeared. Neither had they. That calm response had taught her something about readiness, not as tension, but as openness. Late that night, clouds rolled in again, thick and quiet. A ground crew member stopped beneath a hangar light and listened as the wind passed through open doors. The sound wasn't dramatic. It wasn't ominous. It was steady. And suddenly, he understood why the experience hadn't frightened him. Fear demands urgency. This had offered patience. The realization settled gently. By the 9th day, those who had witnessed the moment found themselves less eager to talk and more willing to listen. To each other. To the environment. To the subtle cues they'd once ignored. Listening, they learned, was an act of participation. Whatever had passed through the sky hadn't spoken. It hadn't needed to. Its message, if there was one, existed in how it moved, how it waited, how it left without explanation. And in learning how to listen to that kind of presence, something within them had shifted quietly, permanently. The city continued its restless motion. But beneath it, a deeper rhythm had emerged, one that could only be heard by those willing to stop and listen. Chapter 10. The shape of what remains. Time did what it always does. It moved forward without asking permission. Days folded into weeks. The airport returned fully to routine. New crews rotated in. Old conversations faded. Fresh weather systems rolled through the skies above Chicago, leaving no visible trace of what had once punctured the clouds. And yet, something remained. Not as evidence, not as proof, but as shape. It lived in the pauses people took before answering simple questions, in the way certain witnesses looked up just a little longer than necessary, in the quiet respect that entered conversations about the sky. What remained wasn't loud. It didn't demand attention. It waited. A senior mechanic noticed it one evening, while walking through the terminal after his shift. The floor shone under fluorescent lights. Announcements echoed with practice.com. Travelers hurried, absorbed in their destinations. He watched them pass and thought, they have no idea how thin the ceiling really is. Not thin in a physical sense, but in a conceptual one. For most of his life, the sky had been a closed book with familiar chapters. Clouds, aircraft, weather delays, radar returns. Predictable, structured. Now, the book had a blank page, and that blankness stayed with him. At home, he sat at the kitchen table with a glass of water, listening to the refrigerator hum. The sound used to fade into the background. Tonight, it felt present, almost intentional. He realized he had stopped filling silence with distraction. No television. No radio, just awareness. The object hadn't added noise to his life. It had removed it. Across the city, a supervisor sorted paperwork long after her shift had ended. She wasn't behind schedule. She simply found comfort in order. Neat stacks. Clean lines. Clear processes. But even as she organized reports, her thoughts drifted. She remembered the moment she'd first dismissed the sighting as a bird. How quickly the mind reaches for familiar explanations. How reassuring that reflex can feel. And how limiting. She paused, pen hovering above the page, and smiled faintly. Certainty, she realized, was often a shortcut. Curiosity required patience. Online, archived threads about the O'Hare incident had become quieter, but not abandoned. A few new users would find them every month, scrolling through old posts late at night, stumbling into a story that felt out of place in a modern world. They asked the same questions. Why no photos? Why no radar hits? Why no follow-up? Veteran readers responded gently. Now, less defensive, less argumentative, because not everything leaves fingerprints, one reply read. Because sometimes the absence is part of the experience. The discussions no longer tried to convince. They invited. A former pilot felt the shape of what remained most clearly during descent. When the city lights spread beneath the aircraft like a living map, he watched the grid of streets glow through the darkness and thought about perspective. From above, the city always looked calm. From below, it never felt that way. He wondered where the object had viewed them from, what scale it operated on, whether it even perceived the airport as separate from the land or humans as distinct from their machines. The thought didn't unsettle him. It expanded him. Late one evening, clouds returned low and heavy. Similar to that, November afternoon, a baggage handler stood outside his building, collar pulled up, watching vapor slide across the moon. He remembered the whole, not the drama of it, but the cleanliness. No tearing. No chaos. Just a perfect opening that appeared and closed without struggle. That image had changed how he thought about disruption. Real change, he realized, didn't always break things apart. Sometimes it passed through, leaving structure intact but perspective altered. At O'Hare, a new employee heard a fragment of the story during a slow shift. Just a sentence or two. Nothing detailed. Nothing dramatic. A few years back, something hovered over that gate. Someone said casually. No one ever figured it out. The new hire laughed softly. Like a drone. The older worker shrugged. Maybe or maybe not, and that was all. But the new hire found himself glancing at the clouds later that night, wondering why the shrug had felt heavier than the words. The shape of what remained didn't force belief. It planted questions. In a quiet office, an analyst reviewed historical aviation incidents, tracing patterns, anomalies, reports that didn't fit neatly into categories. The O'Hare case sat in its own folder thin, unresolved, quietly persistent. He noticed how often it resurfaced in unrelated discussions. As a reference, as an example, as a reminder, it had become a landmark, not in the sky, but in conversation. A marker for where understanding paused, and perhaps where it could begin again. One night, the former reporter dreamed of clouds not breaking, not moving, just holding still. He woke with a sense that he'd been waiting for something, though he couldn't say what. He didn't write the dream down. Some experiences, he felt, weren't meant to be recorded. They were meant to shape you, quietly. By now, none of the witnesses felt the urge to chase answers aggressively. There were no frantic searches, no desperate need for validation. The experience had matured inside them, like a stone settling at the bottom of water, still present, but no longer disruptive. They had learned that not knowing didn't equal ignorance. It could be a form of respect. The sky above Chicago continued to perform its daily rituals. Clouds forming and dissolving, aircraft threading invisible paths, sunlight diffusing through layers of atmosphere. Nothing unusual announced itself, and yet, for those who knew, every ordinary moment carried a subtle depth. Because once you've seen something that doesn't ask to be understood, you stop demanding that the world explain itself. You start listening instead. The shape of what remained wasn't an object. It was an openness, a quiet space in the mind where certainty no longer rushed to fill the gap. And in that space, something gentle endured. Waiting. Chapter 11. The quiet after knowing. There is a particular calm that arrives after a question stops demanding an answer. It is not relief. It is not acceptance. It is something softer than both. By the 11th chapter of this unfolding story, the people touched by that afternoon at O'Hare had reached that calm without realizing when it happened. The moment did not announce itself. There was no clear before and after. Only a gradual settling. At the airport, routines continued to wrap themselves around the days. Flights arrived late. Others departed early. Weather briefings repeated familiar phrases. Yet within those rhythms, a subtle shift had taken place. A controller paused before speaking, choosing clarity over speed. A mechanic lingered a second longer with a system that was functioning perfectly, simply appreciating its balance. A pilot, waiting for clearance, rested his hand on the yoke and felt the stillness before motion. None of them spoke about the object anymore. They didn't need to. The knowing had become quiet. In a small apartment overlooking a busy road, a former baggage handler watched headlights drift past like slow-moving constellations. He used to replay the sighting, in his mind its shape, its movement, the way the clouds responded. Now, he rarely did. Not because it had faded, because it had integrated. It lived alongside grocery lists and work schedules, alongside laughter and tiredness. It had found its place, no longer demanding attention, no longer interrupting thought. He realized that the experience hadn't been about surprise. It had been about scale, about recognizing that the world could hold more than what fit inside routine explanations. At a library across town, the former reporter sat at a wooden table, leafing through old notes. He paused on a sentence Havd written years earlier. If we cannot explain it, we fear it. He underlined the line slowly. That wasn't true anymore. Fear, he understood now, came from resistance. From the insistence that everything must resolve cleanly. The object had refused to resolve and, in doing so, had shown another way to live with uncertainty. He closed the notebook without finishing the thought. The thought had finished him. Online, conversations had shifted again. Fewer debates, more reflections. People shared how the story made them feel rather than what it meant. One post read, "I don't need it to be aliens. I just need it to remind me that not everything is finished," another replied. Maybe that's the point. There was no argument after that. At O'Hare, a young trainee asked an older supervisor why people spoke about the sky the way they did. Not with excitement, not wheat fear. With respect, because once you realize you're not the biggest thing in it, she said, you stop shouting. The trainee nodded, unsure why the answer stayed with her long after the shift ended. Late one evening, clouds formed again dense and layered. A ground crew member watched them from the edge of the tarmac, breathing in cold air. He imagined the space above the clouds, empty and full at the same time. He wondered if the object would ever return. Then he realized something unexpected. He didn't need it to. The knowing wasn't tied to repetition. It didn't require confirmation. It wasn't waiting for proof. It simply existed. In a quiet home, a pilot woke before dawn and sat at the kitchen table while the world slept. He watched steam rise from his mug and thought about motion without force, presence without intrusion. The object had not changed aviation, but it had changed him. He trusted the sky more now, not because it was predictable, but because it had shown restraint. Across the city, someone who had only heard the story secondhand found themselves looking up more often. Not searching, just acknowledging. The quiet after knowing does not feel like closure. It feels like space. Space to wonder without urgency. Space to accept without surrender. Space to carry mystery without burden. By the 11th chapter, the story no longer belonged to the object. It belonged to the people who had learned how to live differently because of it, and in that living, the sky remained wide, patient, and open. Just as it had always been, waiting not for answers, but for attention. Chapter 12. Echoes Across the Sky. By the 12th day, the city had returned to its usual rhythm, yet something intangible lingered in the air, a subtle echo that whispered through the terminals, the hangars, and the quiet corners of O'Hare. It wasn't visible. It didn't have a sound. But for those who had witnessed the object hovering over Gate C-17, it had become a presence that could be felt, a gentle resonance that threaded through everyday life. The early morning fog rolled across the runways, softening the harsh lines of steel and concrete. Planes taxiing into position seemed smaller, somehow dwarfed by the expanse above. One pilot paused on the tarmac, leaning against the fuselage of a Boeing 737, and let his eyes wander skyward. The clouds, low and slow, drifted with deliberate patience, almost as if aware of the previous week's events. He didn't expect to see anything. He didn't even anticipate the familiar sense of curiosity. Yet, his chest tightened just slightly, an involuntary acknowledgement of the unseen, a memory of the moment the sky itself had parted for a silent, hovering enigma. Inside the control tower, a senior air traffic controller rotated in her chair, watching flight patterns trace their invisible paths across the radar. Normally, she relied on the cold logic of coordinates, speeds, and altitudes. But now, a quiet thought persisted at the edges of her mind. The world might be larger than her instruments suggested. The hum of machinery no longer felt purely functional. It carried a subtle reminder that precision and mystery could coexist, and that sometimes the most important observations were the ones her screens could never capture. Donin Konkus, say a baggage handler moved along the conveyor belt, the rhythmic clatter of luggage, providing a familiar soundtrack. Yet for the first time, she noticed the small details she'd always overlooked: the glint of overhead lights on metal handles, the way shadows shifted as carts passed, the way the hum of the fluorescent bulbs seemed to linger longer than expected. Each sensation pulled her mind backward, retracing the memory of the object that had hovered silently, reflecting and absorbing the world around it. It wasn't fear that rose within her, it was wonder, a soft, grounding recognition that something extraordinary could exist, even in the most familiar places. Elsewhere, the former reporter walked through a quiet park, long paths stretching beneath skeletal trees. He stopped, listening to the wind push through the branches, imagining the sky above Chicago the day of the sighting. The clouds had been thick, gray, and imposing, but then a circle of empty sky appeared. No storm, no disruption, just a perfect, fleeting window. The recollection carried a peculiar weight. It wasn't just about what had been seen, but about what had been left unspoken. Every memory, every whispered account, every shadowed reflection contributed to a tapestry of silence that was, paradoxically, more revealing than any photo or radar blip could be. At night, the city seemed quieter than usual, though traffic lights blinked and distant engines roared. On rooftops and along empty sidewalks, several of those who had witnessed the UFO glanced upward instinctively. There was no need to speak about it anymore. The act of looking had become its own language. The sky had become a mirror of sorts, reflecting curiosity back to those willing to notice, to those willing to accept that understanding might arrive slowly or not at all. Online, discussions continued, muted and careful. A few images surfaced from the era, grainy and unverified, but the commentary focused less on evidence than on sensation. "It changed the way I look at clouds," one comment read. "It wasn't frightening, it made me feel like the sky had a rhythm I'd never noticed." Another echoed the sentiment. Sometimes the unknown isn't a problem to solve, but a quiet lesson to carry. The thread itself became a subtle echo of the event, demonstrating that experiences do not vanish. When unseen, they ripple, influencing perception, conversation, and memory. In the hangars, mechanics shared stories quietly, not for recognition, but as reminders to each other. One recounted tightening a panel, pausing to notice the hum of the engines. Another described leaning against a plane, gazing at the sky, and sensing the calm that had persisted long after the object departed. No one tried to explain. No one speculated wildly. They simply allowed themselves to experience the subtle resonancy echo of an event that refused to be fully articulated, but demanded a presence felt deep within. Late at night, a young trainee in the tower gazed out over the tarmac, watching planes glide to their positions with meticulous precision. The trainee had heard the story secondhand and was skeptical at first. Yet, the sky felt different tonight. Layers of clouds seemed more deliberate, the moonlight softer, shadows sharper, as if the heavens themselves were acknowledging those willing to watch. She realized that some experiences were never about confirming what had occurred. They were about how they changed the act of watching, the art of noticing. Even in homes far from the airport, echoes persisted. Residents who had glimpsed the sky during the day's commute remembered the precise way clouds had shifted, the sudden absence of sound, and the subtle, almost imperceptible pause in the wind. They could not explain it. They did not need to. It had transformed their perception, teaching them patience, attention, and reverence for moments that exist beyond immediate comprehension. By now, the memory of the object hovering over Gate C-17 had become something like a secret companion. Not a secret in the sense of hiding facts, but as an experience that could be carried silently, respected, and understood in fragments. Its lessons were quiet. Patience, awareness, acceptance. A reminder that not all phenomena announce themselves with urgency, that the universe could hold space for unspoken truths, and that noticing without expectation could be as powerful as understanding. And yet, the echoes did more than shift perception. They altered relationships with time itself. The fleeting presence of the UFO, lasting mere minutes, seemed to stretch longer in memory than any meeting, any flight, or any conversation. It reminded the witnesses that moments of significance are not measured in duration but in resonance. The sky had given them a fragment of experience that lingered, and that lingering shaped how they moved, how they listened, and how they understood the ordinary world. At O'Hare, the senior controller reflected quietly on the past events. She understood now that the object's disappearance hadn't marked an end, but a beginning. A beginning of attentiveness, a beginning of patience, a beginning of awareness that the ordinary, once scrutinized, revealed its own extraordinary patterns. The sky had echoed the extraordinary in subtle ways, and she had learned to follow those echoes without needing answers. In the city below, the ordinary noises of daily life continued, the steady hum of traffic, the distant drone of an airplane, the occasional bark of a dog. But to those touched by the event, these sounds were richer, layered, and more profound. They noticed cadence, rhythm, and timing. The world, previously a mechanical procession, now felt like a living composition, influenced by a quiet force that moved imperceptibly yet unmistakably through every corner of perception. As the 12th night unfolded, witnesses returned to their homes, to their beds, to quiet routines. Each carried within them the subtle echo of a sky that had opened and closed without warning, leaving behind no proof, only resonance. And as they drifted toward sleep, they understood something profound. Experiences of wonder do not need permanence to matter. Sometimes, their greatest gift is the way they change the way we listen, observe, and inhabit the world. And in that space, between memory and imagination, the sky waited patiently. Always patient, always echoing, always present in ways both seen and unseen. The echoes of what had passed through the O'Hare sky were not a bear, they were simply waiting to be noticed again by those who dared to look. Chapter 13. The lasting silence. By the 13th day, everything felt both heavier and lighter at once. The city's rhythm pulsed as usual planes arrived and departed. Crowds surged through concourses. Engines rumbled along runways, but, among those who had witnessed the hovering object over Gate C-17, something deeper had settled. A silence had grown, not an absence, but a presence. Not emptiness, but a fullness of quiet understanding. In the control tower, the senior air traffic controller leaned back in her chair, hands folded loosely in her lap. For years, her days had been measured by checklists, radar sweeps, and strict schedules. Certainty had always been her anchor. Yet now, Certainty had shifted. The experience above had not yielded answers, but it had gifted perspective. She watched the horizon, tracing clouds that swirled and broke in soft patterns. She imagined the silent disk gliding through them, carrying with it a deliberate calm. "It's strange," she murmured to herself, "how something so brief can change the way you inhabit your day." The words weren't a complaint. They were an acknowledgement. Across the concourse, a baggage handler paused mid-step, noticing the subtle echo of footsteps, the distant squeak of trolleys, the hum of ventilation. He thought about how he had once counted seconds in monotonous rhythm, letting routine define him. Now, he counted differently. He noticed the slant of light across luggage belts, the way shadows stretched and curved as if hinting at unseen geometries. The memory of the object hovering, perfectly still and yet undeniably present, had taught him that awareness was a choice end sometimes. It was the most meaningful act one could practice. At home, the former reporter sat at his desk, no notebook open. The document he had once agonized over remained untouched. Instead, he gazed out of the window at the city lights, twinkling beneath the low clouds. He did not need to record the event anymore. He understood that its significance had moved beyond the factual into something more subtle, a shift in perception, a deepening of patience, a recognition that some truths are better carried than chronicled. Even the young trainee in the tower, once eager to classify and understand everything, had begun to notice the quiet. She caught herself lingering over tasks, listening more attentively to colleagues, appreciating the small patterns of human motion that were normally overlooked. The experience had cultivated mindfulness, an understanding that moments of wonder do not demand explanation, they only demand presence. Out in the city, those who had glimpsed the object, whether briefly or for several minutes, walked beneath the sky with a different rhythm. They did not speak loudly of what had happened. They did not seek validation. But when clouds parted or the wind shifted, they noticed subtleties others overlooked. A sudden glint of sun reflecting off a window, a bird moving with unusual grace, the way light pooled on an asphalt stretch like liquid gold. Each observation carried a silent echo of that day at O'Hare, a gentle reminder that not all phenomena seek recognition, but all can leave an imprint. The sky itself seemed to respect the transformed awareness. Clouds moved in deliberate patterns. Sunsets stretched languidly across the horizon, and stars blinked into view with a quiet patience. There was no need for spectacle. The world had already been altered internally, invisibly, within the hearts of those who had seen. One night, a pilot preparing for a late flight stepped onto the tarmac, inhaling the cold air that carried the distant scent of fuel and earth. He looked up, thinking not of navigation, speed, or safety protocols, but simply of watching. The clouds were low and gray, yet he felt no fear, no urgency, no need to categorize. Hust presens. Just reflection. The memory of the object had taught him that understanding could exist without certainty, and that witnessing could exist without explanation. Back in the terminals, mechanics and supervisors exchanged few words about the incident. Those who had initially struggled to reconcile their sighting had now internalized it. They had learned to inhabit the unknown without distress, to acknowledge the impossible without the need to rationalize. Silence had become a companion, not a void. Even outside the airport, echoes persisted. Civilians who had observed the event, or heard stories from those who had found themselves lingering in moments they would once have ignored. They paused to watch clouds move with deliberation, to feel wind brushing against their skin, to notice the way light fell across surfaces in ways previously unseen. Life itself had become subtly more textured, richer, and more attuned to the unnoticed details. The absence of conventional explanation no longer mattered. No radar confirmation, no photographs, no recordings could add to the truth that had already taken hold. Truth, in its deepest form, had shifted from documentation to experience. An experience, they rarely said, does not require validation. It requires attention, patience, and quiet courage. As the city slept, a few witnesses lingered by windows, porches, or quiet streets. They did not hope for a return. They did not anticipate spectacle. They simply looked, they listened. They felt the faint resonance that had woven itself into their perception, a gentle hum left behind by something that refused to announce itself. By the end of this chapter, and by extension, the journey of the O'Hare sighting, it was clear that the story had moved beyond the event itself. It had become an internal journey, a meditation on presence, attention, and the humility of experience. The object, once a mystery in the sky, had transformed into a quiet teacher, leaving behind lessons that were invisible yet enduring: patience, observation, and reverence for the unknown. And so, the sky remained. Vast, patient, and unassuming. The winds moved. Clouds gathered and dispersed. Night descended, and stars appeared, indifferent to human understanding. But for those who had watched the silent disk hover over Gate C-17, the universe had shifted in subtle ways. It had whispered that not all truths are meant to be explained. Some exist simply to be felt, and in that lasting silence, something profound endured. A gentle knowing that life itself could carry mystery, without fear, without demand, and with a quiet, enduring grace. The sky would wait patiently, always, for those willing to notice. As we close our journey through the skies above Chicago, we are left not with answers, but with a quiet invitation. The object that hovered over Gate C-17 may have departed in mere minutes, yet its presence lingers woven into memory, into perception, and into the subtle ways we notice the world around us. It reminds us that not all mysteries demand resolution. Some are meant to be experienced, to shift the way we listen, to expand our awareness, and to leave us with a gentle, enduring curiosity. It teaches patience, attentiveness, and the beauty of holding space for the unknown. Perhaps the sky holds countless moments like this, unfolding in silence, witnessed by few, and understood by even fewer. And perhaps that is the lesson itself. To slow down, to observe, to marvel without expectation, and to carry the quiet wonder wherever we go. Thank you for joining me in this journey. If tonight's story stirred your imagination, or made you look at the clouds a little differently, consider subscribing and leaving a comment to share your thoughts. After all, the sky is always waiting, and there's always something more to notice, if only we take a moment to look.